Rain came with the riders plaguing the Keystone State, our nation's ominous bosom. We knew what to expect on such a weekend, but preparation is a fallible defense mechanism, limited by our mortal bodies. We overfilled the colonial city, by Saturday floating as a school of many spent swimmers that did cling together and choke our art. Spoonie, a barkeep and a mensch, allowed us to read stories and poems in his palace of the darts, for which we are eternally grateful. His warmth is held in stark contrast to the largest fair of them all, where the lanyardless are banned. One dear friend strummed, and another shared previously unspoken words, both brilliant. I encountered a roving band of men on my final night who called themselves Space Bacon, jamming through the cobblestone streets mid-never-ending tour. I believe them to be the reason I missed my flight. When Shin Sekawake, Wakatakakage, conquered Takayasu the bear for his maiden Yu show, I could not watch, awake and incapacitated. Though I walked in circles each time I journeyed, GPS foiled, efforting to align with roads determined by another time, the scenery was picturesque. Apartment doors and shutters in all sorts of bright colors, and shining bastions of capitalism only eerie when ruminated upon. I still live with the stink of too many beers at a hotel bar, spliffs smuggled through TSA in socks, and forearm-length cheesesteaks ravaged in flooding alleyways. But I also carry warmth and admiration for friends, to come together in the flesh and share. If not balm, it's one of those fancy bandages with the soothing ointment. At pubs, park benches, and chicken joint takeout windows, I was serenaded. And I serenaded. So I recover with no regrets. If anything, there could have been more cheesesteaks.
All right, thank you for joining us for Exhibit B, presented by the Guild Complex. I am Ian Wichkevich, as always. This month, joined by extra special co-host and curator of Exhibit B himself, Mr. Justin Rozier.
Hey, it's great to be here. Normally there'd be a picture of Jim in his absence, but instead we've got Aroma Pizzeria, so shout out to them.
Yeah. And as you just heard from producer Alex, we'd like to shout him out and give him a thank you for his reporting on Exhibit B's trip to Philadelphia for AWP. Jim is still missing because of cheesesteak hangover, but he's on the mend. As for this evening, we have a packed show for you coming. So just you wait. We've got artists from LA, from PA, from Memphis, Tennessee. But before we get started, as always, we'd like to thank our sponsors of this event, the Guild Complex.
Yes, and since 1989, the Guild Literary Complex has served the Chicago community through innovative programming. They view literature as a vehicle of connectivity and aim to merge seemingly disparate groups across Chicago's 50 wards.
All right, one last thing before we get on with our show proper. I would like to acknowledge the fact that we are on stolen land, a result of acts of genocide perpetrated by white settlers and the United States of America against this land's indigenous inhabitants. I recognize the complexity of myself, a non-native person, in doing so, but I do so with an open heart. This land is, was, and forever will be that of the Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Peoria, Miami, and Sioux. I use past, present, and future tenses because Native people are still here surviving and thriving. Indigenous people are leading voices in the struggle against white supremacy, environmental justice, and police brutality. If you want to find out more, we're going to drop a couple links to the Native Lands app. You can learn more about the land that you're on. Please check them out. And all right, we're all set. Let's get into the show this evening. Our first reading is going to be from Cecilia Pinto.
And Cecilia's recently published novella, Imagine the Dog, was the winner of the Clay Reynolds Novella Prize from the Texas Review Press. Her fiction, poetry, and essays have appeared in a variety of places, including locally and Tri-Quarterly, the Chicago Quarterly Review, Fifth Wednesday, and Jet Fuel Review. She was also one of the Guild's 25 Writers to Watch, which, if you may or may know, I was also on that list.
It's a good list.
It is pretty good, if you don't mind me saying so. But she teaches writing at the Chicago High School for the Arts.
Awesome. We're gonna also drop some links for Cecilia, so please go check her work out. And Cecilia, take it away.
Hi. I hope this is working. If it's not, please tell me. I'm not going to read from Imagine the Dog tonight. I'm going to read something else. And I'm just going to give a little preface, which is, I don't think it's uncommon for a writer to become obsessed with a story. Thank you. And I realized as I was writing the story I'm going to read that it was in some way a response to a story that I've thought about and read and reread many, many times. And that story is called In the Night. It's by a Russian writer named Varlam Shalamov, who wrote a series of stories about his experiences in prison camps in Soviet Russia. Way outside my experience. And I think every story has a mystery to it. And I think I just haven't cracked the mystery of that story yet, which is okay. I'm happy living with the mystery. So this is my story, All Saints. And my husband wants me to give him a shout out because he helped me with some of the technical terms here. So, All Saints. Lawrence regretted dropping the claw hammer, but it wasn't really the right tool anyway. He would have rather had whatever was the opposite of a crimper for removing the copper panels from the church cupola. The garage from where he lifted the hammer didn't belong to anyone who really knew anything about tools or forming or unforming standing seams, like on the ridges of the cupola. They were just the kinds of tools a weekend guy might have, nothing serious. The claw hammer had slipped as he tried to panel from the cupola. He listened for a ringing thud as it hit the ground below, but there was none. Phil, who was around on the other side, was staring into the trees, the telephone poles, the alleys, and other buildings. There's a lot going on up here, Phil called out. He was attempting to pry up a different copper panel with a flathead screwdriver, also the wrong tool. Although if they could just find a weak point in the seam, then it would be easy going. Lawrence stared out at the park, feeling the slope of the roof beneath his feet and his worn thin gym shoes. Phil whistled a little circular melody, but Lawrence couldn't identify it. We never did anything like that before, Phil had said, poking at some rice and beans served for lunch at the shelter. Lawrence rolled an orange back and forth under the palm of his hands. Copper's valuable. We'd be set for winter. Money in the bank, that sort of thing. He let go of the orange as he spoke. Got it, Phil said. Now in the fall, they could stroll around the park or sit on stones at the edge of the pond where lime green water lilies provided a contrast to the yellowing grasses and the darker trembling water. You could feel the cool beneath the warm air, and in the evening something seemed to come off the pond and hang there. Some bit of cold vapor, acrid plant water, an old amphibian green, like somewhere a low bell rang and rippled everything. Phil called around the side of the cupola, "Can you come over here?" Lawrence moved around, his feet slipping just a bit, just enough to make his heart known to him. Phil had pried open a seam along the hip and was attempting to lift up and off the large copper panel, yanking at the other seam, which wouldn't give. Things bigger than me, he said. He was tight to the structure, one hand on the copper, the other pinched along its base. It's sharp, he said, nodding toward the metal. You can imagine. Gloves would have been good, Lawrence said. Yep, like living in luxury. For a while, they took turns pulling at the panel, but to pull hard enough would have meant to jerk backwards and risk falling. They popped a copper nail, and as it fell to the ground, Lawrence said, those are probably valuable too. It was late at night, the city quiet but still lit, the lights stringing along the streets out into the vast darkness, cars rolling by below them, and whatever went on in the park. The men stood on different planes of the roof. There were iridescent pigeons roosting along the gutters of the roof, asleep in the moonlight. Phil pointed at them. Nice up here, really. Lawrence nodded. Best job I ever had, night watchman. Nobody to bother you. I await the rapture, Phil said, looking out. I await the police, said Lawrence. Eventually, they returned to the ground, leaving a couple of upturned panels on the structure, which, like most things made by man, remained stuck. The air on the ground was dirty, colder. Whatever had been coming was now here. Looking up, Phil said, still, it was a good idea. Lawrence pointed to a couple of pennies on the ground, and they laughed at their good fortune. Thanks for letting me read. I'm really looking forward to hearing the other people.
All right, thank you so much to Cecilia for being part of the show. Check out those links we dropped earlier in the reading. And next we're going to have Jody Chan.
Yeah, Jody is a writer, drummer, organizer, and therapist based in Toronto. They are the author of Haunt, All Our Futures, and Sick. And that book won the 2018 St. Lawrence Book Award and 2021 Trillium Award for Poetry. They can be found online at jodychan.com, and we'll drop the link in.
Yeah, we'll drop those links again for you. But yeah, enjoy it. Jody, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me at Exhibit B tonight. It's really wonderful to be sharing space across time and distance like this with all of you and also with all the other performers. So I'll be sharing two poems, but I wanted this to be as much about your art and your poetry as it is about mine. So I thought I would share a prompt with you first, and then read the poem that I wrote myself from that prompt. And for the first part of this prompt, I'll read something by June Jordan. Antifada Incantation by June Jordan. I said I loved you and I wanted genocide to stop. I said I loved you and I wanted affirmative action and reaction. I said I loved you and I wanted music out the windows. I said I loved you and I wanted nobody thirst and nobody cold. I said I loved you and I wanted justice under my nose. I said I loved you and I wanted boundaries to disappear. I wanted nobody roll back the trees. I wanted nobody take away daybreak. I wanted nobody freeze all the people on their knees. I wanted you. I wanted your kiss on the skin of my soul. And now you say you love me and I stand, despite the trillion treacheries of sand. You say you love me and I hold the longing of the winter in my hand. You say you love me and I commit to friction and the undertaking of the pearl. You say you love me. You say you love me. And I have begun. I begin to believe maybe you do. I am tasting myself in the mountain of the sun. I wanted to share that poem because before anger became something that we or that systems and institutions of domination that rely on us to not connect to our collective anger we're afraid of. There are lots of lineages and traditions that talk about this space at your core, at the base of your belly, as the source of your aliveness, your chi or life energy. And it's also the space where anger's heat comes from, the same kind of bursting, generative anger we find in June Jordan's work, an anger that is both expansive and fierce, and also inseparable from softness and desire. So just notice what that aliveness feels like in you right now. Notice what's rising, what's seeking out some space to breathe. And for the next part of the prompt, find some kind of vessel. This is mine. And pour that energy, that intensity into the vessel. Let it move through you. Let it pool and collect. Begin to boil over. And then listen with your ears, your eyes, your hands, your heart, all of the ways to listen. Listen to your breath, to what collects in that space of your aliveness. And if no words come, just sit and let yourself keep noticing your aliveness. And I wanted to offer my gratitude also to Susan Raffo, a healing practitioner whose work inspired this prompt. So I'll read my poem now. Because anger insists on a body. One can start a fire with a few of almost anything. Lint, twig, tampon, potato chip. Between us, a scrap of memory falls and becomes a flame, a slurry of reds and golds. In the hours after the fight, you gift me an empty cup, translucent, embryonic, an ember of apology. You brush the ash from my lips. I practice handling the cup without dropping it, or a single unloving word. Preverbal, as in, the place where the body has stored the night on the roof, the bedroom with the teddy bear wallpaper. I thought, time's mongrel throne. I thought, no one survives childhood at arm's length. Once the world was hand-built, hybrida of wet clay and the wounds our parents made. Body of text, body of touch. Body of ancestral land ruled by an occupying army. In some ways, to foment resistance is to discipline the tongue. To ferment wine from rice offered weeks of sweet attention. I reserve my reticent softness for your hands. My aunt massaging moisturizer into mine so someone, someday, might hold it. Agitated by signs of the past, I lick the rim of a vacant vase, taste flint. When I shiver, you raise the utility bill just for me. Lying in the light of your fire, my skin is a fervor of verbs, a late summer reservoir, a reddening yes. Memory passes through a kiln, becomes the inside of a cup, lit by August and no more fathers. Memory, or a museum of what I had wished to extinguish in myself, a schoolyard boiling with children. What unbodies first on the fire altar? Hair, water, soft tissue, organ, skin, bone. Here in the headlong hollowed space of whatever comes next, a scrap of language, gold riven in the cracks. A girl puts the world between her hands, spins out a vessel, a bowl, a body with a red bird in its chest. I absolve the furious, fire-footed years, years aglow with dropped plates and wartime, sweet potato paste and slaps to the face, split frugally between siblings. I bloom now, like a wet clay bowl, made ready, effervescent by your tongue. I brim redly. I am grown. It is snowing ash in my throat. Now the second piece, and then the last piece I'll share with you is an audio piece, which was recorded using this Taiko drum pad, which is just a drum pad but programmed with Taiko sounds. If you haven't seen them, taiko are these big wooden Japanese drums originally. I'm part of a taiko group in Toronto called Raging Asian Women. And here on Turtle Island, there's a lineage of these taiko groups going back to reclamation and reconnection with Japanese culture after internment in World War II, as well as groups taking part in Pan-Asian, Asian American solidarity movements. So I wanted to play with those vibrations and how they might help me access a kind of nonverbal or pre-verbal reservoir of memory around survival and resistance. And so I set them in conversation with this Sento, which in itself is a conversation between many voices of other queer, BIPOC, and disabled writers. I hope you enjoy this piece. At the end of the world, let there be you. Saint of the blue peaks by the ocean where we began, a trail of hands, narrating in the context of ache or tomorrow, crowned with August and salt. I wake in a puddle of ghosts. I hunt the wilderness in myself. These ever-blooming wounds, the damp and swelling mud, blue hyacinths, rustle nude inside the blue water, the way old grief is gentle. To answer your question, I refuse. History is a song, new name for a myth already lived in. The thought of losing sight of shore you know no one can prepare for. Hair falling in torrents, roses of lips, the plummeted paper planes, the angry weather. There is no prayer or pill for this. Ocean, don't be afraid. Ocean, don't be afraid. Ocean, don't be afraid. Ocean, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Ocean, don't be afraid. Ocean, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Ocean, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Alive means you swallow each day like a stone. I too am built out of a question about the sky. If language can hybrida, anemone, ever be enough to repair, begin again, where everything you've lost is washed ashore. I'm building the boat. I believe I exist, a historian of my own silence. Think of a needle dropped into the sea, the moon, a wound on the lake, our footprints to not follow. If you don't have blood on your hands by the end of this, you weren't listening. If you don't have blood on your hands, if you don't have blood on your hands, if you don't have blood on your hands, you weren't listening. By the end of this, you weren't listening. If you don't have blood, if you don't have blood on your hands, if you don't have by the end of this, you weren't listening. By the end of this, you weren't listening. Inside every world, there is another world trying to get out. Warm and blood close, sunglass breaking. Like the light, I am scattered, and what is left is only water.
Really amazing work, Jody. Thank you so much for that. Next up, we have Barbara Polster.
Barbara is originally from Cleveland, now living in Chicago, Illinois. She's an artist, writer, and current faculty at both the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and North Park University, Chicago. Her solo exhibitions include Critical Practices NYC, Glassbox Seattle, William Busta Gallery in Cleveland, and her publications have included Flatland, Critics Union, and Shifter Magazine.
Shouts to Shifter, shouts to Critics Union. We're going to drop her links in the chat, by the way, so check her out. Please. She's great. Love her work.
Take it away, Barbara. Thank you.
A lateral study. Pattern as an infrastructure of governance for image, language, object. In March 2021, James Cone Gallery in New York City opened an exhibition of paintings by artist Michelle Grabner, showcasing Grabner's characteristic attentiveness to pattern and repetition, drawn from textiles found primarily in domestic settings. In series such as the Gingham paintings, however, Grabner draws upon the patterned uniformity of picnic blanket-like plaids with surprising particularity. Upon close inspection, the careful viewer will notice variation, including lines of color that dissipate inconsistently across the canvas, grids that wobble, and the presence of individual brushstrokes, both within and beneath the pattern lines. The press release for the exhibition articulates the political premise underlying her painting practice through the following question: how much difference can be introduced into a pattern field without the pattern field collapsing into unreliability? The notion of the pattern field as container for difference is significant because it would imply that the pattern field could be understood as a form of infrastructure. Infrastructure here can be defined as technologies of technologies, or perhaps more chidingly, the organization of information. Further, if technology may be defined as the organization of information, language as pattern could potentially serve as infrastructure and technology both, a possible inroad or at least a doorstop, facilitating the following questions. Influenced by a renewed interest in the genre-defying textuality of concrete poetry, and the unexpected ways in which I noticed its overlap with movements like German minimalism, or as critic Gregor Quack suggested it be renamed infrastructuralism, I have since reconfigured my previous line of inquiry regarding pattern, Spinoza, and the state. Now I ask, can pattern act as an infrastructure for organizing image, object, and language, where these elements follow the logic of the pattern rather than being beholden to material category? In other words, if pattern is driving the car, can the distinctions between image, object, and language bend or collapse? This is the question currently driving the work forward, an inquiry into semiotics, social structures, and the assumptions made in the process of interpreting information. In 1913, modernist architect Adolf Loos proclaimed that the evolution of culture marches with the elimination of ornament from useful objects. But perhaps this was heavy-handed even for the time. Loos advocated for simple utilitarian objects, long-lasting but easy to fabricate, freeing the worker from unnecessary time spent laboring. But perhaps ornamentation in the form of patterning remained necessary, even then, in support of the infrastructural integrity and organization of this evolution of culture itself. The overarching form that followed function proves to be covertly ornamental after all. Gridded windows, cross-hatched streets, zeros and ones, assembly lines, fishing nets, chain-link fences, concrete casts. Simultaneously, the allegorical is dismissed as ornamental, frequently accused in modernist discourse of being slapped on post facto, a rhetorical bell and whistle. As critic Northrop Frye via critic Craig Owens contended in 1980, however, allegory as a literary element was necessarily structural, with one text ultimately read through another, not tacked on after the work is completed. Reading through Craig Owens once more, Walter Benjamin, in The Origin of German Tragic Drama, identifies fragmentation of language as the primary characteristic of allegory, leading to the dispersal of this disjunctive language and allowing it to acquire an intensification of meaning by the reciprocity of verbal and the visual. Ruins, he claims, are the allegory par excellence, a site-specific memento mori, where the words of man are re-entered into the surrounding landscape. Allegory stands as the calculable result of a process of accumulation. The activity is one of arranging. Perhaps then the infrastructure of the allegorical is that of pattern, or reciprocally, pattern is the infrastructure of the allegorical. The pattern or allegory arranges and activates the accumulation of image, object, and language, as they fluctuate with mirroring obligations to characteristics of material specificity, constitutive, correlative, with bodies simultaneously open to change, recombination, and transformation upon encountering other bodies. Resistant to the binary of self-other, a necessary positive feature of the nature of the substance itself, integral to the functioning of the system. Fragments that are permeable, with little distinction between interior and exterior, thought, language, and extension, objecthood, and image, perhaps any more somewhere in between. The coordination of the phoneme, image, material component, arranged, recalling, pointing to, no longer merely a loss of the original, but a dislocation of the duplicate as well, as it becomes unclear whether our perspective is that of the centripetal or centrifugal, with its similar resistance to narrative or teleology. The substance also possesses an infinitude, where any particular region is both a fragment and representative of the whole simultaneously, both implying a region beyond itself and the internal makeup of the body, with a scale able to be resampled or repositioned at any time. An empty tool, the grid can be perceived in terms of both thought and extension, making it particularly flexible while retaining its general structure. But with the pattern as parameter, parametron, beside measure, the arrangement of word, image, and object is beholden to the material of interval rather than particular motif. Categorical distinctions are of secondary importance as we read through the ruins in cultural detritus, traveling again vertically through the stack of maps, coordinates upon coordinates rather than across their surface. The pattern field as allegorical form draws attention to the form itself as material content. Spinoza's Ethics is a work famously composed geometrically, divided into 5 parts, each made up of axioms, propositions, and demonstrations, thus presenting the points not as authored ideas, but as common notions, reasoned and universally acceptable. In section 5p23, through this universal authorship, the author underscores that the thoughts of the human mind themselves are part of the infinite substance. Thus, even reading through the text of the Ethics is a manifestly eternal act, because the reader's thoughts are in the mind of God. In al its mog it I leave the turn made a full for ing the chur the in Democrat man while pressing for and ling move the ta se to ethical. Key sucks full app in pat field be suit this ma air Democrat struct to specific of part you come it lico d. Third the vo structuring non-article in n it or the sign app of laws. As for Grabner's initial question, how much difference can be introduced into a pattern field without the pattern field collapsing into unreliability? I would have to suggest that the structure of the pattern field must be specific to the nature of its different constituent parts in order to avoid collapsing into unreliability. The challenge, perhaps, will be to apply this back to the socio-material reality of infrastructure.
Fantastic work by Barbara. Thank you for contributing. Our next performer this evening will be the great David Wright Faladé.
Yeah, David Wright Faladé is the author of 3 books: the narrative history Fire on the Beach, Recovering the Lost Story of Richard Etheridge and the Pea Island Lifesavers, and the novels Away Running and most recently Black Cloud Rising. A former Fulbright Fellow to Brazil, Wright Faladé teaches at the University of Illinois and is the 2021-22 Mary Ellen von der Hayden Fellow of the New York Public Library's Cullman Center for Writers. His work has been recognized by the Zora Neale Hurston and Richard Wright Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Texas Institute of Letters. An excerpt from Black Cloud Rising entitled The Sandbanks 1861 appeared in The New Yorker. As always, we're going to be dropping a bunch of links for David in the chat. Please check them out. And David, take it away.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm going to be reading from the first chapter of my novel, Black Cloud Rising, which just came out in February. This is from the first chapter, and it's about a group of runaway slaves who have been raised into a Union Army regiment. Initially, they had not been armed, but their commanding general, Edward Augustus Wilde, who was a real-life abolitionist, a zealot, a little bit crazy, has procured them arms, and he's taken one company out of their base at Fortress Monroe, and they're going into the countryside to confront, arrest a reputed Confederate guerrilla. It was an Indian summer morn. Yellowjacks, like we had out in the sandbanks, roused alongside the day's heat, petulant and unrelenting, lighting onto whatever skin lay exposed, your cheek, the nape of your neck. And like back home, they bit down to let you know that they'd stopped by, as though the buzzing at your ears hadn't already done that. Troopers swatted at the air, despite Sergeant Revere's scornful gaze. I strove not to maintain his same air of authority. The distraction ceased as we parade marched past the Princess Anne Courthouse. Old Glory whipped back and forth on her mast atop the white stone building, though it was clear that she was begrudgingly flown. I silenced my hup-twos, but each and every one of the men kept a steady beat all the same, even unsure Simon Gaylord. Our footfalls had the cadent boom of thunder. Whatever citizen, loyal or not, had not yet learned of our landing, surely did so then. We'd hardly gone 200 paces past the courthouse when the Clapson farm appeared, across a stretch of unflowered and rustling stems where flax had not so long before been harvested. Cuffy, a runaway who had offered up intelligence on the region, finger pointed it out. General Wilde raised the one good arm and our column halted, the booming footfalls of a sudden still. Though nary a head turned, all eyes peeked as one over at the plantation house across the way. That was our target. It was more facade than depth, boasting tall windows and a terrace out front, but just dull planking on the sides, with little texture and no paint. A weather-worn barn stood to the left, a mess of chattel houses to the right. The general had yet to speak word the first. He turned his mount and trotted back down our line, casual-like. Coming abreast of each row, he seemed to take in each man. As he neared me, I noticed that a yellowjack, furry and full, had lit upon his face, above the right eye. The man did not flinch as the deer fly did his due. Wild met my gaze full on. "No need of fighting the inevitable," said he. "Let come what may, the pain cannot last." And he sauntered on. Some minutes later, I heard him spur his mount, and man and rider dashed to the head of the company. General Wild ordered us forward, Bacchus's squad on one flank, Revere's on the other, where the chattel houses were, and mine down the center, straight through the crackling flax. The three lines fanned a half circle around the main dwelling house. Slaves stirred. Some emerged from the barn to take a look-see, even more from the chattel houses, which weren't but shacks with uneven joints and unglassed slits for ventilation. Then a man with disarranged hair and considerable whiskers appeared at the door of the main house. Clapson, for sure, for he carried himself as though proprietorship was his established due. He wore breeches and a long-sleeved undershirt, nothing more, his suspenders not yet raised over his shoulders, and he stepped out onto the broad porch and stared down the general, who'd ridden to front him and not dismounted. Aught other moved. My squad being nearest, I had a box seat view when the general finally spoke. Edgar Clapson, he queried. "You know damned well it is," said the other. "I am Edward Augustus Wild, Brigadier General Volunteers, commanding." He half turned in the saddle and added with a flourish, "The African Brigade." We all just stood there at attention. "I see your nigger pogies," said Clapson, "and I do not recognize your authority." He hitched up the suspenders, an angry gesture, as though they too had vexed his peaceful waking. "I command the Tidewater 12th Home Guard, the Pungo Raiders, and this here is my property." Wild signaled with a nod, and Sergeant Revere, who was nearby, flew up onto the porch in 2 quick strides and seized Clapson meanly by the shirt and by the nape. "Unhand me," said Clapson. 2 troopers joined Revere, and they forced the man down the steps and wrestled him to his knees, beneath the general's gaze. "Pogies, sir?" Wild said. "Did you say pogies?" Clapson would not respond, so General Wild continued. "These men are Armageddon's agents, both Gog and Magog. Your world is no more." He turned toward us, the rest of the company. His voice boomed. "Guerrillas are cowards and murderers, without honor, no better than land pirates, and their fate is either quarantine or death. This land pirate's property is hereby confiscated. Seize all men, women, and tykes. Seize the grain and any implements and tools. Fill every hogshead, fill every buckboard. It is all contraband, and it returns with us." Corporal Fields broke the men into teams, and I sent this one toward the barn and that one toward the chattel houses, where slaves were still falling out. And what had been puzzlement and gloom now turned to pure rejoicing. I could not know whether my own face showed it, but I was much overjoyed too. I was directing some men loading a handcart with farm tools when I overheard the runaway Cuffy saying to the general, "All slaves buck they slaves." His head was bowed, but his voice clear and strong. "But this one, he in the habit of stripping him head to heels, gals as likely as men's, whatever the age and for the least offense. And he lay it on sportly." The general's expression did not change, but something was moving underneath. "I know of at least one that ain't survived it," said Cuffy. And I noted then what aforehand I had failed to see. A whipping post, well used, standing erect between the dwelling house and the barn. Or, what was more likely, my eyes had until then dodged seeing it. I had never suffered the lash, but what slave did not know it? General Wild, come abreast of Clapson, still disdainful of dismounting, leaned low from his saddle. Even the women, said he, even the women? Revere yanked Clapson to his feet, unbidden by the general, but the order clear. The Secesh pulled like a colt then, no one certain what was next. Revere, with a fistful of hair and a fistful of cloth, dragged him toward that upright timber. Shackles hung from its foretop point, and while two troopers wrestled the man's lurching and writhing, Revere hitched him on by the wrists. The yard was dead still, us colored, slave as well as soldier, watching on. Mrs. Clapson's mouth lay wide open, lips a-quiver, but no sound came forth. Their three little boys, though, each one wailed. The general marched his mount to the barn and into it, then returned with a bullwhip over the pommel of his saddle. He rode it over to Revere. Clapson yanked at his wrists, crying to be released, all plea and no protest now. Pungo Raiders, said the general. How quaint. And with this, Revere, again obliging some unspoken command, lit the air with that long leather hide. Once, and again. Corporal Fields was then aside me, and I'd not heard him come up. Damn, Richard, he said. Damn. It was neither pity nor pleasure in his voice, just blunt astonishment. For who among us could have imagined this? The bottom rail on top, a nigger flogging a legal white man. The general bid Revere to stop just 4 lashes along. Clapson's head slumped low, his lips whimpering curses. The general prepared to address us troopers gathered around, or so we initially thought. In fact, he was speaking at them others. Lady, said he, his voice musical with sympathetic timbre, I won't ask that you disclose this man's blasphemies against your virtue. Instead, I present the chance to settle old scores. The yard stood still. Even Clapson's sons had ceased to wail. From the crowd emerged an old mammy, head wrapped in a red rag, cheekbones like straight razors, a burlap dress hanging as long and plumb as her own long self. She crossed to the post, a deliberate stride that made the 30-odd paces seem a damn sight more distant. When she got there, she unfastened a tie and the topmost burlap dropped to the waist. Dugs as flat as griddle cakes lay like sad folds of flesh against her chest. It didn't seem she retained a tooth in her head. This here the only virtue of being a Clapson nigger, said she, her voice gravel and as purposeful as her movements. She turned, and her back was a tangle of fleshy welts. Ain't aught left here to blaspheme, but I expect I might take you up on that scoring bit. Mass Clapson's come up as long due. The general took the coiled cowhide from Revere and handed it to the old mammy. She let it out along the ground, reckoning the proper distance. Once she'd settled onto the right spot, the cowhide sang. And then I heard the rest, the other slaves cheering, troopers too. I heard Mrs. Clapson's rejoined wailing, and the rebel Clapson begging, mercy, Jenny, oh mercy. Vengeance can be justice, well earned and meted out fairly, and yet it be vengeance all the same. The cowhide sang. And I'll stop there. Thank you all.
All right, thank you so much again to David Wright Faladé for being part of the show with us, and thank you to all our other performers this evening, Jody Chan, Cecilia Pinto, Barbara Polster, and as we said, David just now. Thank you again to our sponsors, as always, the Guild Literary Complex of Chicago. We're going to drop some links for them again, as well as actually dropping our own website's link in there. So go check all those out. Yeah, real website. It's real. All our stuff's on there. Check us out. So, until then.
Yeah, and shout outs to the National Book Critics Circle, which I'm on the board. They sponsored our September show at Printers Row Lit Fest. I'm going to be on a panel for them next Thursday at, what day is that? April 7th?
Yeah, some day in April.
Yes.
But we'll drop a link in the chat for that as well. So, yeah, if you can give Justin the National Book Critics Circle.
Heather Scott Partington, Liz Taylor, Rishi Reddy, Mandana Chaffa, Jenny Han. That's about the Emerging Critics program, which I went through back in, 2018. God, life is very long. Yeah. That's at 8/7 Central. And then we are back 2 months out, May 26th. So check us out then. And that's in person. Yeah. We don't know where, but we'll holler.
Yeah, check keep an eye out for details. Please. We'll be getting stuff out there soon. But yeah, until then, see you soon.
Yeah, thanks. This is great.